Fast and Furious 11 might not just end a story, it might quietly rewrite everything that came before it, and that's the most dangerous and exciting idea the franchise has ever played with, because for over 20 years Fast and Furious trained audiences to believe that every movie adds something new: bigger villains, higher stakes, louder finales. But Fast 11 is rumored to do the opposite by stripping meaning away from past victories and reframing them as steps toward an unavoidable collapse. In this theory starts with one uncomfortable question: what if most of what we saw wasn't heroic progression but delayed consequences? Because when you look back, every major win Dom achieved came at the cost of escalation. Fast 5 turned street racers into international targets, Furious 7 turned family into soldiers, Fate of the Furious turned trust into a liability, and Fast X finally showed the bill coming due. And Fast 11 might be the movie that openly admits this by revealing that the saga was never about winning at all, it was about postponing loss, and that changes how we view every character, especially Dominic Toretto, because instead of being the man who always saves the day, he becomes the man who kept the wheel pointed forward even when stopping was the only way out. And insiders suggest Fast 11 will lean hard into this idea by intentionally echoing moments from earlier films but twisting their meaning. Scenes that once felt triumphant will be mirrored as warnings, and this is where the rumored structural twist comes in. Fast May 11th be designed to feel less like a sequel and more like a retrospective, forcing the audience to emotionally relive the entire saga while slowly realizing that the pattern was never broken. And the most shocking part is that this reframing doesn't require retcons or plot holes, it only requires one perspective shift: the idea that Dom was not wrong but incomplete, and that realization could be delivered through the most unexpected device: the return of Brian O'Connor, not as a savior, not as a fighter, but as living proof that another path always existed. And once the truth is spoken out loud, the franchise can no longer pretend that escalation was inevitable. And that's why Fast 11 being marketed as the end feels deliberate, because you can't rewrite the past without first convincing the audience that the story is over. And once viewers believe this is the final chapter, they are emotionally vulnerable enough to accept a reinterpretation of everything that led here. And that is a bold move, especially for a franchise built on comfort, familiarity, and repetition, but it's also the only way Fast and Furious can evolve without collapsing under its own weight. And if this theory is right, Fast 11 won't erase the saga by invalidating it, it will erase it by transforming it, turning victories into warnings, heroes into symbols, and the road itself into a question rather than an answer. And that is exactly the kind of twist that doesn't just end a movie, it lingers long after the screen goes black. And once that question is planted, Fast 11 can begin doing something no previous movie in the franchise ever dared to do, which is make the audience doubt the logic of the fast life itself. Because up until now every film rewarded risk, loyalty, and escalation with survival, but Fast X already cracked that illusion by showing that no amount of skill or family unity can fully control chaos. And Fast 11 is rumored to push that idea even further by revealing that the system Dom and his crew have been operating in was always unsustainable, not because they were wrong but because they never allowed an ending to exist. And this is where the idea of erasing what we know becomes terrifyingly clever, because Fast 11 doesn't need to undo events, it only needs to change how they are framed, turning the saga into a cautionary loop rather than a power fantasy. And American audiences especially are sensitive to this kind of narrative turn because it mirrors how long running cultural myths eventually confront their own cost. And this makes the rumored role of Brian O'Connor even more crucial, because Brian is the one character whose story already contains an ending, and when he reappears it creates a narrative contradiction that the movie can't ignore: a man who stepped away and lived peacefully versus a man who stayed and kept running. And if Fast 11 places these two paths side by side, it forces the audience to re-evaluate which one was actually heroic, and that single comparison has the power to retroactively reframe the entire franchise, turning Dom's endurance into obsession and Brian's disappearance into wisdom. And that reframing opens the door to the most radical possibility of all, that Fast and Furious does not need to keep escalating because the most powerful story left to tell is about stopping. And this is where insiders believe the movie's structure becomes almost confrontational, intentionally slowing down moments where the audience expects speed, using silence where explosions once lived, and letting uncomfortable truths linger, because Fast 11 is not trying to hype the future, it's trying to cleanse the past. And by the time the final act approaches, viewers may realize that the real twist was never about who survives or who wins, but about whether the franchise itself has the courage to redefine success. And if it does, then Fast 11 won't just be remembered as another sequel, it will be remembered as the moment Fast and Furious stopped chasing bigger stakes and finally asked what all that speed was running from. And that question lingers long after the last engine noise fades, because Fast 11, if it truly follows this direction, becomes less of a movie and more of a reckoning, not only for the characters but for the audience that grew up idolizing this endless forward motion. And the film could quietly suggest that the reason the Fast family keeps surviving impossible odds is not because they are invincible, but because the story itself refused to let them face consequence until now, and that realization reframes every miracle escape, every last second save as borrowed time rather than destiny. And this is where the idea that Fast 11 is not the true finale hits hardest, because endings are about answers, but this movie is about asking the one question the franchise avoided for 2 decades, which is what happens after the legend stops being useful. And insiders hint that the final moments won't close with a race or a victory, but with a choice, one that doesn't explode or resolve cleanly but simply opens a door and lets characters walk away without certainty. And that is far more unsettling than any cliffhanger, because it removes the safety net of spectacle and leaves only humanity behind. And if Brian's presence, even in a limited symbolic way, reinforces that idea, then Fast 11 becomes the quiet bridge between what Fast and Furious was and what it could become, a franchise no longer trapped by the need to top itself but free to exist as legacy, memory, and myth. And that's why this story resonates so strongly with American audiences right now, because it mirrors a cultural shift away from excess toward meaning. And if Fast 11 dares to end not with speed but with stillness, it won't feel like weakness, it will feel like maturity. And that might be the boldest move this franchise has ever made, because slowing down after all this time is the one thing nobody expects, and that's exactly why it could change everything.